My first discovery this evening is that the podium drives. Okay, so if you suddenly see rapid acceleration, you'll know what it is. Good evening. I'm glad you could be here this evening to join me in sharing some thoughts about this book. I want to tell you a little bit about its origin, of how I came to write it, and I'll also read quite a number of excerpts from the book to give you an idea of what it's like. And then there'll be a time for some questions at the end. The book is, of course, organized as most books are, with a introduction. There's a prologue that is entitled Driving as a Child, where I share some of my driving experiences before I even had a driver's license. And then there's also a chapter for each of the 34 cars I've owned. And each chapter has specifications on that car. So if you want to look up and see exactly what it was, you can do that. There's also several interspersed chapters about technical advancements that happened during my lifetime that I thought were significant. And this may not mean something to everybody, but if you're a car enthusiast, you'll probably relate to some of them. And I also threw in a chapter with a little bit of philosophical insight, where it's a chapter called Dating. Is this the word? I think it fell off. Dating and Cars in the 60s, where I share some of my own observations. So I won't delve into every chapter because there's 34 of them, and this could take all evening, and we don't have that much time. So let's start out. I grew up on a farm by Elbing. I think everybody here probably knows where Elbing is. I have a family with 4 siblings, and my older siblings, since I'm the youngest, are, I would say, all somewhat academic. I'm probably the outlier in the family. I consider myself more of a mechanic than an academic. So this book, in other words, this book has no philosophical theme. There's no hidden sermon. It's not an academic endeavor, and there's no moral to the story. It's just a pure labor of love, where I share the mechanic's thoughts on some things, and I like to write stories. So this is a collection of those. So a little bit of background as to how this all came to be is that I've been intrigued with machines since I was a little kid. My earliest memory is of being able to identify every car on the road by make and model and years. Now, that was easier then. There weren't as many as now. I also remember a local mechanic, Frank Epp, some of you know, taking the time with me to show me when I was very young how a 4-cycle engine works with a real engine torn apart. And that's kind of when I became hooked, and kept playing with engines, so that when I was about 12 or 13, my dad let me do an engine overhaul on our Farmall amp. It ran afterward. There's another story that ties in about this time in my life. When I was probably 10 or 11, the big hero in my life was my cousin Herman Janzen. He was 10 years older than me, and had a farm shop, and he loved to build things the way I did too. So he invited me, and we started building a sort of a small car. It was a glorified go-kart. Everything was going on fine. We were just about to drive the thing. We were kind of looking for an engine, when he came one evening and said, I can't work on this anymore. And I said, why? He said, well, because we've got a baby coming. Well, that baby's sitting here in the audience. There's there. He ruined the first car because nothing happened after that. So my dad, of course, allowed us to have free access to a farm shop. There was no supervision. We just did what we wanted to. In fact, the way I learned how to weld was when he came in the shop. I was trying to build a soapbox derby car, and there was tape wrapped around everything, trying to hold wood together. It was a kind of a mess. And he looked at it, and he was first of all upset that I used all this tape. And then he said, if you want to build something like this, you need to use iron. So he turned on the welder, gave me a helmet, and showed me how to weld. And that was a great asset because I could start building serious stuff after that. So I guess you could say, when all said and done, I'm a gearhead, if you want to call it that. And that's one of the names they use for people. I call it car enthusiast, whatever. So my father, actually, I inherited some of this from him in a strange way. I think he lived at the best of times automotively, because he was born a year and a half before the Model T came out and turned to and became an adult when they built the 15 million one 20 years later. So during this time, rural life massively changed. There were machines, there were engine powered machines, there were cars, and so on. And one of these, he and his brother sort of took to this by learning by doing. There were no rules at the time. You could do what you wanted. So somewhere about when they were, Uncle John was 15 and my dad was 8. I'm going to show you a picture here. This isn't them. Make sure I got the right picture here. No, that's one of the contraptions we built.
That's you.
I'm just going to show these first. There's another one typical of the kind of things kids made in those days. Now I'm going to show this one here because this isn't my dad or anybody I even know. I just found this on the internet because I wanted to show you. This is sort of the contraption I'm going to read about in this first excerpt. Imagine my dad at 8 years old and Uncle John about 15 with one of these. My Uncle John, or my uncle, related about how he would get the cows home from the pasture for milking with their stripped down Model T. He would skillfully navigate the Model T directly beside a cow so that his younger brother, my father, sitting in the passenger seat, could reach out and grab her tail, hang on tightly and not let go until their mission was accomplished. Following a quarter mile of this skillful maneuver, over some bumpy pasture terrain, the exhausted cow was ultimately corralled into the milk barn, while all the while, my father allegedly never let go of the cow's tail. Though this tale seems a bit far-fetched, it does help explain my father's often reckless driving habits. His behavior behind the wheel frequently exhibited actions that seemed to ignore other drivers on the road. These were likely habits acquired from learning how to drive without having to share the road, or pasture for that matter, with other drivers. Any of you who rode with my dad, you know what I'm talking about. It's perhaps no surprise that there's a little bit like father, like son here. Because the driving a lot of engine-powered equipment as a kid on the farm, you learn a lot of driving tricks. This next excerpt explains a little bit what happens. From the very first time I drove a motor vehicle, an early 1950s Chevrolet farm pickup, I learned important driving skills. The technique of using the clutch and shifting gears was learned early at slow speeds. There was plenty of experimentation with a burst of acceleration that sometimes caused the rear wheels to spin on the gravel, then followed by sudden braking. At around 12 or 13 years of age, I even learned about the dangers of driving on ice. On my way to a piano lesson, a short 2.5-mile trip. Remember, I'm about 12 here. The combination of some ice, ruts, and a heavy foot on the accelerator resulted in the Chevy pickup veering off the road and through the ditch. Though I was likely only traveling at perhaps 30 miles per hour, the right front wheel managed to align itself perfectly with a wooden fence post as if it were a ramp. The pickup had just enough momentum to roll up the post and lay over on its left side. Panic hit me quickly, and within seconds, I had pushed open the passenger door enough to crawl out of the cab and jump on the road. By the time I had run the quarter mile to the house where my piano instructor was waiting for me, I had burned up most of my adrenaline. She immediately sensed that something was wrong as I breathlessly asked her to use the phone. I explained what had happened, and my father said he'd be there shortly to pick me up. By the time we arrived at the overturned pickup, our farmhand was already there with a tractor. A chain was quickly connected to the frame of the pickup, and a brief pull from the tractor brought the pickup back on all four wheels, having suffered no body or chassis damage. Not surprisingly, I wasn't asked to drive the pickup home. Though I was physically and emotionally spent that day, my father never spoke to me about what had happened. Looking back at the accident now, I suspect he had a similar experience in his family. And he simply concluded that I had learned my lesson. Well, indeed, I learned a little bit of caution that day, but I didn't lose my desire to use that teenage adrenaline to push the performance limits of whatever I was driving. It was just something that was innately there. So I discovered some interesting ways to take my dad's '56 Buick and figure out how to make a Dynaflow do a burnout. It cost a transmission later on. So let's move on here now to okay. So given my tendencies at around age 16 or so, my dad must have contemplated how to keep a teenage boy at home on a summer evening. And what he did is we managed to find this car. You notice there's no engine right in front of it. There's not on the picture, is a pallet with a Chrysler Hemi V8 sitting there. 1954 Chrysler Hemi V8. And the challenge was to get that engine hooked up in the car and get it running. We weren't quite sure what it was, but it worked. I spent every evening I had after working on the farm all day, I'd spend as late as I could until my dad would yell out and say, "It's time to go to bed. We have to put up hay tomorrow." So we worked at it, and finally it was ready for a test drive. So there were a few things that weren't entirely up to par as we started. The hydraulic clutch was still a bit mushy because it needed to be bled a few more times. The throttle worked reasonably well, although the spring was too tight. I was sitting on a wooden crate, and one door was held shut with some wire. After all, this wasn't an Apollo launch, so there were no detailed checklists to proceed before takeoff. I put the coupe in first gear and slowly let out the clutch while feathering the throttle in an attempt to have some control of the impending takeoff. The coupe lunged forward. As I hit the brakes, I simultaneously tried to steer to avoid hitting an evergreen tree. It was then that it became apparent that something might not be quite right with the steering. A bit more testing revealed that the torque of acceleration would lift the big Hemi engine enough to allow the original Model A steering to move, just enough to correct the direction of travel. As soon as I let up on the gas, or worse yet, hit the brakes, all 960 pounds of that V8 came down. That's about 3 times the weight of the original engine. And then overtaxing massively overtaxing the capability of the stock steering gear. But with a little practice, it was possible to herd the beast down the road and have some serious fun. When asked to do so, the Hemi was totally capable of literally frying the rear tires. The steering problem, however, ultimately kept the speed of the coupe mostly under 40 miles an hour. Driving was a bit hazardous because under certain circumstances, the steering wheel would cramp up and the coupe would continue drifting in whatever direction it was headed. The only escape at that point was to punch the throttle, correct course, let up on the gas, and then give it gas again, wherever you're going. This was not exactly a safe way to drive an overpowered car, but there was no denying it was incredibly exciting. That's the end of that story of that car. Just a footnote. Several years later, the car was sold to a gentleman who took it to 81 Speedway and raced with it. It ultimately met its demise there. I never heard the full story, wouldn't tell me. I've always been suspicious there might have been a little steering involved. So when I was about a freshman in high school, I for the first time had a chance to see this car. sit in it, touch it, and I knew that someday I would own one. Four years later, I had one. And for the, I don't know, are there any real gearheads out here, people who like engines and stuff? Raise your hand. Okay, there's a few. Just for you, the stock 283 was replaced with a 327. Headman headers were added, a little bit more exciting cam, and the stock 3-speed was exchanged for a Muncie 4-speed close ratio. The car was now fun to drive. It was awesome. And I drove it a lot. It ended up going to 4 different countries. It made it to Canada, Mexico, and even Guatemala. The stories about some of these trips are in the book. So I'm going to add one bit here. I'll put the next picture up shortly. So I'm quoting now from the book. So did the Corvette have an impact on my college love life? Absolutely. And here's what happened. About 4 years after I bought the Corvette, I went on a date with a young lady who loved my sky blue Corvette. We hit it off well, but she was also still dating another young man who drove a very nice red Thunderbird. For at least a month, she cleverly played both of us. Her friends thought she had it made. One evening in a Thunderbird, the next in a Corvette. How was this going to end? This is a game that can only be played for so long. Was this a contest between cars or suitors? Eventually, there was a winner. The Thunderbird just couldn't compete with the Corvette. And the best part of this contest was that she really liked the guy who owned the Corvette. In this case, when she gushed, "I really like your car. Can you take me for a ride?" She actually liked the guy and the car. I was a happy young man who had it all. A beautiful girlfriend who enjoyed riding around with me in my Corvette. Could life get any better? Yes, it could get even better. Not quite 2 years later, we were married. And she let me keep the Corvette. In fact, in the 50 years since then, we've owned 3 more Corvettes. I'm truly a lucky man to have found such a wife. Did the 59 Corvette win her over, or was it my charm? Or is she a really clever woman who knows how to play a man with his cars? So I'm going to jump back in time here just a little bit, because during the time I had this Corvette, there was a year where I was went on an exchange program to Germany and lived on a farm not far from Munich, Germany. And I realized soon that I needed wheels while I was there. And I hunted and found an old, really old 1949 Volkswagen Beetle. That's the first year they made them. The British still ran the factory. And it was the only reason I got it so cheap was because when you drove it, it blew a big cloud of smoke by it. So I needed to do an overhaul. The only place I had to do an overhaul, it was November. The only warm place I could find was in a room in a farrowing house. On a farm site. So on a wheelbarrow, I had the engine, took it all apart, did everything manually, hung the cylinder walls, ground the valves by hand, and did everything, got it back together in about a month, and it ran wonderfully. It was a really good little car. It wasn't anything fancy. Remember, it had a 24 horsepower engine, non-synchronized transmission, mechanical brakes, and everything going right, downhill with wind. It might get a little over 60 miles an hour, but it was wheels. That was the important thing. I had made friends with a young German man while I was there who was in med school, and we took a lot of weekend trips together and ran around together while I was there, and decided to take a trip with the car the last month I was there, and we headed off to France and Italy to go along the Mediterranean coast. Let me get here the next picture. Now, while writing this book, I discovered or rediscovered a kind of a journal that I kept during that trip. So I'm going to refer to that here in this excerpt. I'll let you know when it starts. We eventually reached the coast and made our way to the French Riviera. As would be expected, considering where we were headed, when two young men travel together, our conversations often involved what type of women we liked. The choices for discussion were endless: tall versus short, blonde, brunette, and of course, there were stories about girlfriends lost and hoped for. It was after a day of such conversation and driving that I wrote my thoughts. This is in the journal. So now we've been in Saint-Tropez a couple of days. It's becoming obvious that this is a city on the Riviera that appears to be exclusively for the rich and famous. There are hundreds of stunningly beautiful women here, that they are inaccessible because we don't speak French and quite obviously are not rich or famous. It was painfully clear that Bridget Bardot, who lived in Saint-Tropez at the time, would not be joining us for dinner in our anytime soon. Now, here's a quick view of the map of where we drove. You can kind of see we went west to Nancy and then down to Marseille and along the coast to Pisa and back to Milan and so on. It took about a month and was a lot of fun. In fact, I won a bet on the trip. I won a bet with the local mechanic who right before we left said, I don't know, it was 100-day mark or what, we made a bet the car would never make the trip. So when he got back, he had to pay out. And I actually ended up selling the car. I wish I had kept it. That car is today worth about, anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000, depending on who has it and what the condition is. So we're going to move now to the car. The Corvette was finally sold and replaced with this car. I was able to buy my first muscle car, a nice 66 Corvette with a 427. It had a lot of power and was everything I needed in the way of oomph at the time. Anyway, it was the car we had when we got married. And so one of the things that you're well aware of at that time in marriages, after marriages, there were car decorations. You decorate the car and then there'd usually be a chase afterward. Well, here's what happened. In our case, my two future brothers-in-law were not likely to be of much help controlling what might happen to our car. In fact, another post-wedding tradition presented an even greater problem than how the car might be decorated. It was common to follow the newlyweds as they left the church to leave on their honeymoon. These chases could get a bit reckless and even dangerous, especially when they were trying to keep up with the 427 Corvette. Plus, my brothers-in-law each had cars they felt capable of a worthy pursuit. In fact, the challenge was definitely on. They were looking forward to the post-wedding escapade. The only limiting factor would be how fast our wives would let us drive. Now, I'll give you a spoiler alert if you read the rest of this. This does not end up in a Fast and Furious episode. So the cost of fuel for this 427, it ran only on premium. It was a high compression engine. Along with the news that I was going to become a father, necessitated a search for a Corvette coupe, aka family car. The thought of how you transport a baby in a convertible did actually get to me, and it had crossed my mind. So I'll continue. I was fortunate that my new wife wasn't threatened by my parallel love of fast cars. As long as we could pay the bills, she was okay with my car passion indulgence. So she bought into the idea of a Corvette coupe as a beginner's family car. There was sufficient room behind the bucket seats to put an infant carrier. And I'm going to switch to the next one here, the next car. Sure got the right one. As my wife's pregnancy progressed, watching her get in and out of the Corvette coupe provided me with a mixture of entertainment and sympathy. Clearly, providing viable transportation to a very pregnant woman was not likely on the minds of the Corvette design engineer, or myself for that matter. But on the flip side, when the day came that we needed to get to the hospital now, we definitely had the right car. However, when the time came to put the infant seat with a baby in the storage area behind the bucket seats, the concept of family car seemed somewhat of a stretch. A bit of panic set in as I began to realize the inevitable dilemma fatherhood presented. Sometime down the road, likely within a year or so, this beautiful new baby is here somewhere, there he is, was going to replace my other baby, the red Corvette coupe. As long as the baby was in the infancy, the storage area behind the bucket seats worked out just fine. But what would we do when we needed a car seat? There was no back seat, just a toddler crawl space. Now, later on, he did stay in there long enough till he started hitting his head, sticking through between us. So. Now, obviously, you know the car has to be sold. So, the chapter 11 is entitled, "What Was I Thinking?" How do you transition from a nice Corvette to a Pinto? Well, I blame Lee Iacocca. You all know who he is.
Yes.
He was chairman of a Ford Motor Company who designed the Mustang and started the pony car craze, and did a masterful job at it. So a decade later, when Lee Iacocca is coming out with a new car called the Pinto, he's got a lot of logic. It's technically looks like it should be fine. You know, everything looks like it would be okay. But the car wasn't out yet. So I bought it. I ordered a new one, exactly the way I wanted. I got the disc brakes in the front. I got the German engine. Everything should have been fine. Well, reality turned out to be a little bit otherwise. It was a bit of a disappointment. But while we had it, 2 more kids came along. So now we had to have something bigger. And the only next thing. We were broke. We didn't have much to spend on anything. So anyway, it was a totally utilitarian choice. And this, in terms of everything I valued about automotive performance and handling, our 1974 Pinto wagon was an all-time low point. It was underpowered. There was nothing sporty about it. And it was a wagon with faux wood sides. Several years earlier, I would have never believed that I would ever own such a vehicle. But the necessities of parenthood can take a footloose and fancy-free young man, fast forward his life a decade in a matter of months. Suddenly, so many things that were far more important than my choice of transportation. With 3 preschool children in our lives, our trips were almost totally local. And our budget obviously didn't have that involved. However, back in the deep recesses of my consciousness, my desire for fast and powerful cars had not yet been extinguished. With noisy kids cooped up in the backseat of the Pinto Squire wagon, I made a vow that somehow, someday, I would work my way back to owning a car that was fun to drive. I didn't know how long it would take, but I would do it. It was at this point that the realization that came to me was that I was becoming very familiar with cars and how I like to drive them. And I came to the conclusion that some cars that were either willing or unwilling to participate with me the way I want to drive it. And so I decided, and this has nothing to do with power or horsepower or speed. It has to do with the eagerness of the car. And if you're a car enthusiast, you may grasp what I'm talking about. I can feel it minutes after I'm in a car. It's like getting on a horse that wants to ride with you or a horse that wants to fight you along the way. You know when they're wanting to go with you. When you let them go, they go even faster. Cars are just like that. And they have personalities. You have to get familiar with it. So I was in this dilemma now with these sluggy cars. Eager to have some automotive excitement on a tight budget, the Hardin County surplus equipment auction provided an unexpected opportunity. When the auctioneer finally reached the second cop car, the city employee informed him that the car wasn't in running order. But he was told to start it anyway. The grinding noise that came from under the hood made the audience cringe. Just a little repair work and this bagel will be running like new, the auctioneer exclaimed, as he started the bidding at $750, trying to get 1,000. There were no takers. So he dropped the bid to 500, still no bids. Finally, he cried out 250 several times. I was afraid the city might no sale the car, so I raised my hand. The auctioneer repeatedly tried to get 300 and then suddenly yelled out, sold! I had just purchased my first police car. It turned out to be a lot of fun. I'm going to show you a little video here next. First of all, this. It did need some work once in a while, and this is the farmer way of it. You know, there is a safety block under the loader.
What year was that car when you?
83, I think. There's a Mercury Marquis, actually. I might get that to go here. I get anything to move.
No,
Okay.
it's on, it's on.
Okay, now, I'm gonna just run this. Some of the fun they had was our kids. Oh, sorry. Some of the fun that our kids had with it is they made a video called Harry-O. It's in the book, you can look it up online. Kind of a drug bust thing, Harry-O type thing, and the car was part of the video. I'm just gonna show the first few seconds of it because you gotta get the drift. Okay. Okay, that's where the drug bust happened. There's another chase later on, going the other way. Oh, man. Okay. Anyway, there were a few other stories about that cop car, like when Kelly, our daughter, passed a stranded motorist at night on Remington Road and decided, I'm not stopping. You know, here the police car pulls up, goes around, and the stranded motorist was justifiably upset when he flipped her off as he drove by. And she came home and said, I'm not driving that car anymore. No, really, what's safer than putting a 16-year-old girl in a police car? Okay. Little by little, our car purchases started to get better. One of the first ones to come along was a Audi 5000 S, which had introduced us to some really wonderful German engineering and fabulous driving. And then the Honda Prelude introduced us to Japanese engineering of small cars that were really fun to drive. Not necessarily overpowerful, but an absolute delightful handling and a dream to drive. This car was purchased hopefully from me, but ended up being our son's car. So I didn't get to drive as much as I wanted to. Now, this one was a bit of a surprise and turned out to be absolute delight. There was a Honda Civic 94, and it was a special model they had called EXSI. Had a unique little engine that you could wrap out to over 7,500 RPM, phenomenal shifter, and just was more fun than a go-kart. In fact, it was a little too much fun. The final 10 miles of my morning commute involved a gentle dogleg in the road to accommodate a creek. Though not a Formula One course, the course always invited a bit of pushing the limit around the bend. Farther down the road was a correction line that added two more gentle curves, waiting for attack. Finally, about 3 miles from my destination, the road crested a sharp hill and then dropped quickly into a flat valley where the road stretched out for over a mile and then curved twice to avoid a flood dike. If I could see no oncoming traffic or anyone ahead of me, this was an invitation to drop the hammer. One time, while performing this maneuver, I didn't realize that someone had been following me. As I began teaching my first hour class, this is in high school, one of my students raised his hand and asked a question. Mr. Janzen, do you know how fast you were going this morning back to school? I couldn't even keep up with you. Okay, though he was driving an old farm pickup, this was still more embarrassing than getting a ticket would have been. I had been caught behaving like a kid. But as the bumper sticker on my dad's pickup so elegantly stated, you're never too old to enjoy your childhood. I suppose it could be said, some boys never quite grow up. So one more fun car that came along here was a Lexus GS 400, which I actually bought from our son there. And my first ride in this car convinced me that I would need to have that car. As I stepped into the brand new silver Lexus GS 400, I eagerly anticipated the exhilaration I was about to experience. Hang on were the words that drifted by as my back pressed into the seat. The torque curve was perfect as the GS 400 snapped through the gears. I was soaking in the rush that came with this level of acceleration. I hadn't experienced this since the heady days of my 65 427 Corvette. Wow, this was fun. I was now, though, presented with a gearhead father's dilemma. I had spent years teaching this young man how to drive responsibly. And suddenly I was in seventh heaven enjoying his irresponsible driving. How fast are you going? I asked as I tried to glance at the speedometer. My son, who was grinning from ear to ear, replied, "You want to try it out?" Several 0 to 90 runs later, we took the GS for a cruise on the interstate. The car handled superbly, following my commands as if I were driving a motorcycle. Even the brakes were awesome. 100,000 miles later, the GS 400 was mine. 200,000 miles later, when I dropped the hammer, that car still delivered everything it did when it was brand new. And in fact, during the time we had it, we would often argue as to who got to drive it. And I could get that picture here. There we go. That's it, yeah. We'd often argue as to whose day it was to have the car. So mechanically sound, there was one thing that happened after that many years. The paint was starting to peel. And it was starting to look a little rough. But mechanically was still good. So I ended up selling it to a mechanic friend who lives by Elbing, and the car may still be running around. He said he discovered that his daughter also found out how much fun it was to put the accelerator on that car. And he hadn't realized that till he got that car. So I did own one more Corvette. I'm just going to show a picture of it. I'm not going to tell anything about it. The car was a little bit bigger and bulkier than I liked. I preferred my old ones to it, but it was a very powerful and fun car to drive. So lastly, in the process of writing this book, I wanted to try to have similar images of every car for every path, for every chapter, so they'd be all the same. I thought I'd get AI sketch to do this, but it didn't work. It didn't follow my rules. I said, I want a 54 Chevy, then don't put fins on it. It was no good. So I contacted several sketch artists and discovered that they were really expensive. And then I stopped working on the internet one night, looking for pictures and things. I stumbled onto this website.
What model? What year is that red one?
The red one, 98. I've stumbled into this website called Americna. And at first I couldn't figure out anything on it because it was all written in Russian. And I kept doing some digging and with Google Translate, finally got things figured out and contacted the web developer, the man who owned it. I discovered this was a hobby of his. He and several other guys are trying to make a big catalog of cars all over the world. They have thousands in there. And they had about 5 or 6 of mine, exactly what I wanted. And I said, could you do this? Could you? Oh, he said, I'd love to. I'll add them to our collection. So we worked together for a year, and there were some real challenges along the way. And we emailed back and forth and had a wonderful time and have become good friends in this process. I've never met him. But when I finished the book and tried to send him a copy, I discovered you can't do that from the US right now. You can't get anything sent to Russia. So I took the book along to Germany and for 10 euros, got it to Russia. I don't know if he's got it yet. It was only about a week ago when we did that. So he is likely said he would be watching tonight. So he may be able to live stream this. And if he is, we say hi to Alexander and thank you for your wonderful work. All right. Do we have any questions? I answered yours on 98. Where?
Over the years, what car do you regret never finding or wanting?
Not finding or wanting.
What car did you wish you bought?
Yeah.
What car do you wish you'd bought along the way that you passed on?
That's a great question. I don't know anything I would have been within an achievable purchase. That was the problem. But a lot of them that I would have wished for. I would suppose if I had been really brilliant, I would have picked up a Shelby Cobra in the 60s. A real one. Although I think the kids are probably better cars.
Well, maybe I'll ask the opposite question, which is, other than the Pinto, is there any car you regretted buying?
Well, there is one car in there that we bought on an emergency reason. Because we ended up stranded at her parents in Iowa. I went to the car dealer and I said, we needed something to get home. And I said, do you have an old fishing car or something? He said, yeah, I do. And I bought a 1962 red Comet wagon. We drove for a little bit longer than we wanted to. We were right between Corvettes at the time. And we referred to it as the vomit. It had almost no redeeming value to it. In fact, the funny story, and it's in the book, is that when I brought the car home to her house to pick up and go, her dad said, "You're not going anywhere in that car." I said, "What?" He said, "You need tires." And I said, "Really?" He said, "You're not hauling my daughter in that car unless we get new tires." We went to the Gamble store and he bought 4 new tires. And oh, man, I didn't want to spend any money on that car. And anyway, it ran just fine. It was just handling wise and performance wise, absolute disaster. It was a cheap Falcon that tried to be a Mercury. Any other question?
At one point, halfway through the book, you rented a 300 days Mercedes,
Yes.
but for some reason, I didn't see any time where you ever bought a Mercedes.
No.
Instead, you bought one of those Audis that had an acceleration problem. Now, why was that?
Okay. One reason I didn't buy a Mercedes, they were a wonderful driving car, but I never sat in one that I thought had a comfortable seat. I didn't like their seat. That leather is just slippery and bushy. I don't know. And they were literally unaffordable for us here.
That sheepskin
Yeah,
cover, such a.
yeah, something in there. The Audi, main reason we ended up with the 5000S was because of the unintended acceleration story on 60 Minutes. I don't know if any of you ever remember that. Diane Sawyer became famous through that episode, and it was I would call it scam, but it was an unphysics supported reporting disaster. And it nearly folded Audi. Consequently, I didn't buy into the argument they made on the car, so when the prices dropped dramatically, we suddenly could afford one. And it drove very well.
Well, that actually happened to someone we know. In accelerated in the garage and ran into the wall when it shouldn't.
And what they had a trouble with, in my opinion, was I wouldn't delve into the technical too much here, but this was at the time when they were trying to do early smog correction on cars, and they often had too fast an idle. And this car had an unusually fast idle, and there was no brake interlock to time. So a lot of people would start the car up and put it into gear, and before they even knew what happened, it was going out the door. And so it backed across the street, and people got this image of the car having overwhelming power and taking off like crazy. My thought right away was, I heard the story, is that the distance you travel going 0 to 60 under acceleration versus the time it takes to stop from 60 to 0 means that no car made at that time, if you put both pedals to the floor, it will stop. And that's what later on then they proved and showed that was the case. So for the people who ran across the street, they probably had their foot on the gas and didn't know it. Or they just didn't do anything. It was going pretty good way.
Ed, it won't surprise you that that car with him had intended acceleration.
As I mentioned in the book, there's any kind of acceleration is a good thing. It's always in
I
control.
have one more question. A 65 Corvette you have.
Yeah.
Did you ever take it out on the quarter mile without Hennie knowing?
What do you mean?
To see what it would do? What would it do in a quarter mile?
I don't know for sure. I can tell you the exact speed. But I mean, we definitely did that a few times. It wasn't, I mean, it wasn't a measured quarter mile where like all of a sudden it goes through, let's look at the speedometer. But it would have been the 66. is the one.
Oh, 66.
Yeah, that's the 427. It was a dangerous car in some ways because it was woefully undertired. So, go ahead.
My boyfriend in high school drove a 1962 or 63 Comet, not a wagon, but a Comet.
Oh, yeah.
I never knew if it was cool or not. What do you
The
think?
Comet. The Comet with the right engine in it. Later on, actually, it was a pretty cool car. But this was a 62 with the smallest 6-cylinder engine it had. And I mean, it needed a few things, like the shocks weren't that great. It wanted to bounce when you drove. And we were just wanting to make one trip back to Kansas with it, and then I was going to jump. I ended up actually selling it to my brother, who drove with that for quite a while.
So was it cool?
Was it?
Was my boyfriend cool?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Well, surely there's a couple of speeding ticket stories right there.
Yeah, there are. There's 4. Only 4. But I got 2 in 1 year. And with months apart with our Lexus ES 300, it was just kind of a fluke. And my friend back there, my attorney friend Bob, helped me get a, what's called a diversion. Is that what it's called? On the second one, because I had to drive, and it was sneaking up on me. Actually, I will tell you something about ticket. I never got a speeding ticket when I was intentionally speeding. Only when I wasn't paying attention, just listening to the radio or whatever. And so I hope to think I'm a fairly careful driver.
What was the biggest fines?
Oh, I don't know. At the time, I'm not sure. That was back in the, what had it been? 90s, early 2000s. I think it was like $170 or something. It was pretty, it bit. I bought a radar detector after that. It didn't help. It was just an annoying beep all the time. And then they got instant on and it was kind of useless.
So when you went to Germany, what did you rent to drive the Autobahn?
What did I do?
What did you rent
Oh,
or lease
yeah,
to
we-
drive the Autobahn?
Okay, when we went there, as a family, one time we had a Toyota Camry wagon, a pretty old one. That we drove through Czechoslovakia and back through Austria, a big loop from the Netherlands. And then another time we had this is when it was just hitting me, we had a BMW wagon, three series wagon with a diesel engine in it. But it drove wonderfully, it was pretty powerful, but driving a diesel was just weird with the stick shift. Because every time you think you're just maybe going fast enough in the gear, it's gonna get interesting, the governor would shut it down. So you had to always shift early. I couldn't get used to that for a while.
Well, like you, I had a need for speed, so when I went to Germany to get on Autobahn, that's the one thing, and the only car they had was a German-made Ford Escort. Didn't run very well after I took it back. We saw what it would do.
There was always a time we drove often there between, from about the German border into the Netherlands. There's a stretch where the Autobahn is pretty open usually. And my dear wife here, one time we were driving there, came up there, the road was wide open, nothing there. And she said, I know what you want to do, don't you? Yeah. Okay. So we have a chance to try out a top end in a reasonably safe environment.
My brother Todd, who's your son, who's watching on Zoom, had the question, what car do you regret not buying when you had the chance?
That's a good question. I'm not sure which one I would say on that.
How about it? I think we said,
Well, yeah, I mean, there would have been any cars for collector sake. I'm thinking in terms of something that had a lot of passion.
Like something where you drove off the dealer lot and wished you had.
Yeah, there's been a few of those. Where you drive on the dealer lot. Probably, anything like when you get to try out some cars that they let you drive. And like a hot Mustang or had a wonderful time with our other son, the boy who just called recently, when he bought a BMW M2 and we test drove one in Wichita. Now that's the car I could have driven home with. And that was really a fancy, fast car. He takes it to a track, runs it on the track, so it has potential. Any other questions?
so it's genetic.
Oh, yeah. I just hope I'm not as reckless a driver as my father was. He was a guy who could slip past a dozen accidents and never have one get him. So the only one that he was ever in, a really bad one, was when his nephew, he was learning how to drive in a VW Super Beetle. A mile, they were driving on a country road, a mile before the accident happened. At the corner when they stopped the stop sign, my dad says to my nephew, Mom says she thinks we ought to wear these seat belts. A mile later, they get T-boned. And the car rolls 4.5 times. And he comes out of it with just a really dirty arm that was hanging out the window. And he managed to escape things like that all the time. He would drive and cars would slide to miss him and what's their problem? In fact, it was, now that he's not here, I can say this, but it was bad enough that we were careful when we let our children ride with him.
Mark, are you working on a sequel?
Yeah,
The pickups that you had on the farm, like fingers,
Yeah.
iron digger.
well, I thought about
Different ones we had.
trucks that hold me.
See,
But-
Mark, my father farmed with Mark for a number of years, and during some of these years where the cars weren't quite so souped up, Mark would have a pickup truck that would spin its tires very well, and so your dad, my dad would get their dollies, off the farm pickup, because that, business, you could do that. Where the family car, you weren't allowed.
We were both known when it got off the road that the pickup could be driven really hard. And he once, when there was a fire in the Flint Hills and we had some pasture on fire, he and Lyra and I were, hired men, were all stuffed in their pickup. And that pickup, was an old manual 4-wheel drive type. And we were heading as flat out, hard as we could go. coming over the hill, high patrolman, on the opposite way. And we all said the same thing. And we thought surely he'd turn around. He didn't. And we went on and got the cattle we rescued, from the pasture. And then the high patrolman shows up to stop traffic. And he walks over there and says, I didn't, why I didn't stop you? And it's something about, well, I figured I knew what you were doing, where you were going. And he said, by the way, you were doing about 92. Which had to be the max capacity of that pickup.
That pickup had a 4-speed of 411 and about 80
Yeah.
wrapped out as.
I know. We were going downhill.
Did you ever own a GTO? And what is the top speed that you ever attained?
That I attained while driving. No, I did not have a GTO. That top speed is a tough question. Because older cars in the 60s, the higher the speedometer went, the more inaccurate it was. And part of it had to do with the way the dial was made too. So on the Autobahn, in somebody else's car, I've gone really fast. But myself, I probably never got above 120. No, with me driving, now there were times, a couple of times, when I was pretty cautious with other people driving. I don't particularly, unless I know who the person is and how they drive. So there were many opportunities in high school to get killed by bad drivers.
Yeah.
What's the story about trying to get from Peabody to home before the song was over?
Oh, that was my cousin Jerry. His dad had a 51 International pickup, those things that scoot like this, and we would get out of basketball practice, and the song was out in the West Texas town of El Paso. I fell over, I can't remember who sings it, Jacob.
Marty
Rollins.
Devil woman.
Yeah, we would try to make it home from that song. It's about 5.5, 6 miles on dirt road. And one night we came to the Walton Road and he didn't even slow down. He just flew across it and right behind his shoulder went the headlights. I mean, those things happen when you're young. And we're all lucky that we make it. Well, hey, thank you for coming out this evening. If you're interested in reading more or buying a copy, we have some back there. The hardback costs $20 and the paperback is $15. That's kind of a bargain in today's book world. And we have a Venmo tag if you want to use that. And check, cash, anything else works too. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a few of these excerpts. There's many more in the book. I could probably keep telling you off the top of my head for another 10 hours if you want to listen.